What if I told you that a single coin sitting in your junk drawer right now could be worth more than your car? It sounds crazy, but it happens every single day. Regular people just like you are finding ordinary-looking coins in old jars, inherited collections, even loose change from the gas station, and discovering they're sitting on thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars. The thing about rare American coins is that they don't always look rare. They don't glow. They don't come with a label. They look like pocket change because that's exactly where most of them still are. A slight minting error, a specific year, a tiny detail almost invisible to the naked eye, and suddenly a penny isn't a penny anymore. It's a down payment on a house. Today I'm going to show you 4 of the most sought-after rare and old United States coins ever produced. 4 coins, 4 stories, 4 fortunes hiding in plain sight. Some of these you've heard of, some of these you haven't. But by the end of this video, I promise you, you will never look at a handful of change the same way again. So go grab whatever coins you've got sitting around your house, hold them close, and let's see if you're holding onto history and don't even know it yet. Let's get into coin number 1. What you are looking at right now is one of the most quietly extraordinary coins ever produced by the United States Mint. At first glance, it looks like an ordinary wheat penny. It is small, copper-colored, worn in the way you would expect a coin from the early 1940s to be worn. It has the familiar bust of Abraham Lincoln on the front, the words "In God We Trust" arching across the top, Liberty on the left side, and the date 1941 on the right side. On the reverse, you see the 2 wheat ears framing the words 1 cent and United States of America with E pluribus unum across the top. It looks completely normal, but if you flip the coin over and look very carefully at the front, right below the date, in the exact spot where a mint mark should appear, there is nothing. No D, no S, just smooth, empty field. And that absence, that tiny missing letter, is what transforms this from a 3-cent coin into something genuinely rare and historically fascinating. To understand why this coin exists and why it matters, you need to understand how the United States Mint operated in 1941, and specifically how the Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco mints each produced their own coins using a shared system of hubs and dies that was designed to be identical in every way except for one tiny punched letter. So let us walk through the entire minting process from start to finish, because every step in that process is relevant to understanding how this era happened and how it slipped through unnoticed. The story of any coin begins with the planchet. A planchet is the blank metal disc that will eventually become a coin. It is not yet a coin. It has no design, no lettering, no raised rim. It is simply a round piece of metal of a specific weight, diameter, and composition. In 1941, the standard composition for a Lincoln cent was 95% copper and 5% tin and zinc, a bronze alloy that had been in use since 1909 when the Lincoln cent was first introduced to replace the Indian head cent. The planchets for Lincoln cents were manufactured by a process that began with long strips of bronze alloy. These strips were fed through a machine called a blanking press, which was essentially a heavy-duty punch press equipped with a die and a corresponding hole. The punch would come down through the strip, cutting out a perfect circle of metal. Each circle was called a blank. The blank was slightly larger than the finished coin would be, because during the minting process, the metal would flow outward to the edges, and the extra material was needed to form the raised rim. After the blanks were cut, they went through a process called annealing, where they were heated in a furnace to soften the metal. Bronze, like most metals, work hardens when it is deformed, meaning it becomes harder and more brittle as it is shaped. By heating the blanks to a specific temperature and then cooling them in a controlled way, the mint could restore the metal to a soft, ductile state that would accept the impression of the dies cleanly and completely. After annealing, the blanks were cleaned in a process called pickling, where they were dipped in a mild acid solution to remove oxidation and tarnish that had formed during heating. They were then washed and dried. The next step was called upsetting, and this is where the blank became a planchet. The upsetting process involved feeding each blank through a machine that had a rotating die with a slightly smaller opening than the blank itself. As the blank was forced through this opening, the metal at the edges was pushed upward and outward, forming a raised rim around the circumference. This raised rim served 2 purposes. First, it protected the design of the coin from wear, because when the coin was placed flat on a table or stacked with other coins, the raised rim would contact the surface or the other coins, not the design elements. Second, it helped the metal flow properly during the actual striking process, ensuring that the design was fully impressed all the way to the edges. Once the rim was formed, the object was officially called a planchet, and it was ready to be struck. Now, before we get to the striking itself, we need to talk about how the dies were made, because this is where the error that created this rare coin occurred. The die is the steel tool that actually imparts the design onto the planchet. It is a hardened steel cylinder, usually about 3 inches in diameter and about 3 inches tall, with the coin design engraved or impressed into one flat face. When the planchet is placed between two dies, one for the obverse, which is the front, and one for the reverse, which is the back, and tremendous pressure is applied, the metal of the planchet flows into every groove, channel, and depression in the die faces, and the coin design is transferred. The question is, how does the design get onto the die in the first place? In 1941, the United States Mint used a multi-step reduction process that began with an artist creating a large-scale model of the coin design. This model was typically about 8 inches in diameter, roughly 4 times the size of the finished coin. The model was made of plaster, sometimes coated with bronze or shellac for durability. Every detail of the design, every letter, every fold of Lincoln's coat, every wheat stalk, was sculpted by hand at this large scale. Once the model was approved, it was placed in a machine called a reducing lathe, or more precisely, a Janvier reducing lathe, which was a remarkable piece of equipment imported from France and used by mints around the world. The reducing lathe had 2 spindles. One held a stylus or tracer that would slowly trace over every detail of the large plaster model. The other spindle held a hardened steel cylinder called a master hub blank. As the tracer moved over the model, a cutting tool on the other spindle moved in perfect synchronization, cutting the design into the steel hub blank at a reduced scale. The reduction ratio was typically 4:1, so every movement of the tracer on the model was translated into a movement 1/4 the size on the steel. This process was extremely slow. It could take several days to complete a single hub, with the machine running almost continuously, the cutting tool making pass after pass after pass, gradually deepening the design into the steel. When the process was complete, the result was the master hub. The master hub was a positive image of the coin design, meaning it looked exactly like the finished coin would look, with the design raised up from the surface. It was the physical embodiment of the artist's work, translated into hardened steel. The master hub was then used to create master dies. A master die was made by placing the master hub face down against a soft steel die blank and applying enormous pressure in a hydraulic press. The raised design of the hub was pressed into the steel of the die blank, creating a negative impression, a mirror image, where the design was sunk into the steel rather than raised. This was the master die. One master hub could produce multiple master dies, and each master die could then be used to produce multiple working hubs. The working hub was made the same way, by pressing the master die into a soft steel hub blank, creating another positive image. And from each working hub, multiple working dies were produced by pressing the working hub into soft steel die blanks, creating the negative images that would actually be used in the coin presses. This multi-generational process, from master hub to master die to working hub to working die, was necessary because the mint needed a very large number of working dies to keep up with production. In 1941, the Philadelphia Mint alone produced over 887 million Lincoln cents. Each working die could strike somewhere between a few 100,000 and perhaps 1 million coins before it wore out or broke. So the mint needed hundreds, even thousands of working dies per year, and the hub and die system was how they got them. Each generation was a stepping stone that allowed the mint to multiply the number of dies available without going back to the original master hub every time, which would have been impossibly slow and would have risked damaging the master hub through overuse. Now here is where the mint mark comes in, and this is the critical part of the story. In 1941, there were 3 mints producing Lincoln cents: the Philadelphia Mint, the Denver Mint, and the San Francisco Mint. Philadelphia Mint was the main mint, the original mint, and by tradition and convention, coins produced at Philadelphia did not carry a mint mark. If a coin had no mint mark, it was understood to be from Philadelphia. The Denver Mint used the letter D as its mint mark, and the San Francisco Mint used the letter S. These mint marks were not part of the original hub design. The master hub, the master dies, the working hubs, all carried the full design of the coin, but with no mint mark. The mint mark was added later, at a specific point in the die-making process, by a mint employee using a small steel punch. The punch was a tiny steel rod, about the size of a nail, with the letter D or the letter S engraved in relief on its tip. After a working die was produced from a working hub, but before the die was hardened through heat treatment, a mint employee would take the die, position it under a small press or even use a hammer, and carefully punch the mint mark into the die by hand. The mint mark was placed in a specific location, and for Lincoln's cents, that location was on the obverse, on the right side, directly below the date. The employee would position the punch, strike it, and the letter would be impressed into the soft steel of the die. This was a manual human step in an otherwise highly mechanized process, and it was a step that was vulnerable to human error in ways that the rest of the process was not. Now, here is where we need to talk about what happened in San Francisco in 1941. The San Francisco Mint was producing coins at a significant pace. Over 92 million Lincoln cents were struck at San Francisco in 1941, each one bearing the S mint mark. To produce that many coins, the mint needed a substantial number of working dies. We are talking about dozens, possibly over 100 obverse dies for the cent alone, each of which needed to have the S mint mark punched into it by hand before it could be put into service. The die room at San Francisco was a busy place. Dies were being produced, hardened, inspected, and dispatched to the coin presses on a continuous basis. The employees in the die room were skilled workers, but they were also human beings working under production pressure, and the mint mark punching step was just one of many tasks they had to complete on each die before it could be sent to the press room. The specific error that created the coin you are looking at occurred when a working die was produced at San Francisco, hardened, and sent to the press room without ever having the S mint mark punched into it. This die went through every other step of the process correctly. It was impressed from a working hub, it was heat-treated and hardened, it was inspected, and it was installed in a coin press. But somewhere in the sequence, the mint mark punching step was skipped. Perhaps the employee who normally punched the mint marks was absent that day and someone else filled in without fully understanding the process. Perhaps the die was set aside temporarily during the punching process and then mistakenly moved to the hardening stage as if the punching had already been completed. Perhaps the die was punched, but the punch did not engage properly, leaving no visible mark, and the inspector did not catch it. We will never know exactly what happened, but the result was that a die that should have carried the S mint mark entered production with a blank field below the date, identical in that respect to a Philadelphia die. Once that die was installed in a coin press at the San Francisco Mint, it began striking cents. Every coin it struck would bear the San Francisco design characteristics, the specific die characteristics unique to that die, but with no mint mark. To the naked eye, and even to many experienced numismatists, these coins looked exactly like Philadelphia cents. They had no mint mark, and in 1941, no mint mark meant Philadelphia. There was no reason for anyone at the mint to flag these coins as unusual, because the absence of a mint mark was not visually remarkable. It was the default. It was what a normal coin looked like. The error was not a dramatic visual anomaly like a double die or an off-center strike or a clipped planchet. It was an error of omission, an absence rather than a presence, and absences are inherently much harder to notice than additions. A coin with a double date jumps out at you. A coin with no mint mark looks like every other coin from Philadelphia. The question of how many coins were struck from this die is impossible to answer with certainty, but we can make some inferences. A typical working die for Lincoln cents in the 1940s could strike somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 coins before showing significant wear, and sometimes more than that if the die held up well. If this no mint mark die was in service for even a portion of its potential lifespan, it could have struck tens of thousands or even more than 100,000 coins. All of those coins would have entered circulation alongside the 92 million legitimate San Francisco cents and the 887 million Philadelphia cents from the same year. They would have been mixed together, shipped to banks, distributed to businesses, and spent by ordinary Americans who had no reason to look twice at them. They were, for all practical purposes, invisible. Now let us talk about what this coin looks like up close, so that if you ever encounter a 1941 wheat penny, you know what to look for. The first thing to understand is that you cannot simply identify this coin by the absence of a mint mark alone, because every 1941 Philadelphia cent also has no mint mark. The absence of the S is necessary but not sufficient. What you need to look for is a combination of the missing mint mark and specific die characteristics that are associated with San Francisco production rather than Philadelphia production. One of the most important things to examine is the area below the date on the obverse. On a genuine 1941 S no mint mark era coin, the field below the date will be completely smooth and flat, with no trace of an S, no raised bump, no depression, no artifact of any kind where the mint mark should be. If you see even a faint outline of an S, even a partial or broken letter, that is a different variety, perhaps a filled mint mark or a weakly struck mint mark, not a true no mint mark error. The field should be absolutely clean. But again, so should the field on a Philadelphia coin, so you need to look deeper. The next thing to examine is the overall style and quality of the strike. San Francisco cents in 1941 tended to have certain characteristics that distinguished them from Philadelphia cents. San Francisco coins often had a slightly softer strike than Philadelphia coins, particularly in the details of Lincoln's hair and the wheat stalks on the reverse. The San Francisco Mint was known for producing coins that were sometimes not as sharply detailed as those from Philadelphia, due to differences in die preparation, press setup, and striking pressure. If you have a 1941 cent with no mint mark that shows the softer, slightly less crisp strike typical of San Francisco production, that is a clue. But this is a subtle distinction that requires experience and ideally a side-by-side comparison with known Philadelphia and San Francisco examples. Another thing to look for is the specific die characteristics of the individual die. Every working die has tiny, unique imperfections that are transferred to every coin it strikes. These can include die polishing lines, die cracks, die chips, and other minute features that serve as fingerprints for that particular die. If numismatists have identified the specific die that produced the no mint mark error, they can document its unique characteristics, such as a particular pattern of die polishing marks in the field, or a small die chip in a specific location, or a faint die crack that develops after a certain number of strikes. These die diagnostics are what allow experts to definitively attribute a no mint mark 1941 cent to the San Francisco era die rather than to the Philadelphia mint. Without these diagnostics, a no mint mark 1941 cent cannot be conclusively attributed as an error, because it might simply be a common Philadelphia coin. This is one of the reasons why authentication by a professional grading service like PCGS or NGC is so important for this variety. The grading services have databases of die characteristics and can compare a submitted coin against known examples of the error die to make a definitive attribution. If you are examining a coin in person, use a good magnifying glass or a jeweler's loupe, ideally at least 7 power or 10 power magnification, and look at the area below the date very carefully. Hold the coin at an angle to the light so that the light rakes across the surface. This raking light technique will reveal even the faintest traces of a mint mark that might be too weak to see under direct light. If you see absolutely nothing, no trace of an S, then you may have either Philadelphia cent or the San Francisco no mint mark error. At that point, you need to look at the other die characteristics, the strike quality, the specific polishing marks, and ideally have the coin professionally authenticated. Do not assume that every 1941 cent without a mint mark is the error, because the vast majority are simply Philadelphia coins worth a few cents each. Now, how many of these no mint mark San Francisco era coins are believed to survive today? This is a difficult question, and the answer is necessarily an estimate based on limited data. The total number of coins struck from the error die is unknown, but even if we assume a conservative estimate of 50,000 to 100,000 coins, the number that survive today is likely much, much smaller. These coins entered circulation in 1941 and were indistinguishable from ordinary cents. Nobody was looking for them. Nobody was pulling them aside. They were spent, lost, damaged, worn down, and in many cases destroyed. Copper cents from this era were heavily circulated, and many were eventually lost, hoarded for their copper value during later periods, or simply worn beyond recognition. The survival rate for common-date Lincoln cents from the 1940s is actually quite low in any recognizable condition, because they were used hard in everyday commerce. Of the coins that do survive, the vast majority are in circulated condition, showing significant wear. It is estimated that perhaps only a few hundred examples of the 1941 no mint mark era survive in collectible condition today, and possibly far fewer. The number that have been definitively authenticated and attributed by professional grading services is believed to be in the low dozens, perhaps fewer than 50 certified examples across all grades. This is an extraordinarily small population, especially when you consider that over 92 million San Francisco cents were struck in 1941 and over 887 million Philadelphia cents. The era coins represent a tiny fraction of 1% of total production, and the surviving examples represent an even tinier fraction of that fraction. When it comes to condition, grades, and value, the same principles apply to this coin as to any rare coin, but with even greater intensity because of how small the surviving population is. In the lowest collectible grades, meaning good 4 or very good 8, where the coin is heavily worn, Lincoln's portrait is flattened, the wheat stalks are mostly smooth, and the lettering is worn but legible, the value is still significant because of the rarity of the era itself. A certified 1941 no mint mark era in good or very good condition might sell for somewhere in the range of $100 to $250 at auction. In fine condition, where the coin shows moderate wear but more detail is visible, particularly in Lincoln's hair and the wheat grains, the value might range from $250 to $500. In very fine condition, where the wear is lighter and more of the original detail is present, the value could be in the range of $500 to $1,000. In extremely fine, where the coin shows only light wear on the highest points and most of the original design details are sharp and clear, the value might climb to between $1,000 and $2,000. In about uncirculated condition, where the coin retains nearly all of its original detail with only the faintest trace of wear on the highest points, the value could be in the range of $2,000 to $4,000. In true mint state condition, where the coin has never been circulated and retains its original mint luster, the value increases dramatically. An MS-60 or MS-61 example, which is uncirculated but may have significant contact marks or weak strike, might sell for $4,000 to $7,000. An MS-63 example, with fewer marks and better eye appeal, could bring $7,000 to $12,000. An MS-64, with strong luster and relatively few marks, could command $12,000 to $20,000 or more. And in MS-65 or higher, with full original luster, minimal contact marks, and excellent eye appeal, the value could potentially exceed $20,000 to $30,000, although examples at this grade level are so rare that establishing a reliable market price is difficult. The simple truth is that if a gem uncirculated example were to appear at auction, the final price would depend on how many serious collectors were paying attention and how badly they wanted it, and it could go even higher. It is also worth noting that the value of this coin is heavily dependent on professional certification. Because the era is so subtle and so easily confused with a common Philadelphia cent, any collector who believes they have found a 1941 no mint mark era should submit it to PCGS or NGC for authentication and grading. A raw, uncertified coin, even if it is genuine, will always sell for less than a certified example because buyers cannot be certain of the attribution without expert verification. The grading services have the expertise and the reference materials to make a definitive determination, and their encapsulation provides the market confidence that is essential for achieving full value. The story of this coin is, in many ways, the story of how the most extraordinary things can hide in plain sight. A die was made without a mint mark. It was installed in a press. It struck tens of thousands, maybe over 100,000 coins. Those coins went into circulation and looked exactly like the most common coin in America. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. They were spent on groceries and bus rides and newspapers. They were dropped on sidewalks and pushed through cash registers and stuffed into jars and piggy banks. And somewhere in that vast ocean of ordinary cents, a tiny number of them survived long enough for someone to look closely, to notice the empty space below the date, to ask the right questions, and to connect that absence to a specific die at a specific mint in a specific year. That is what makes this coin special. It is not flashy. It is not dramatic. It is a ghost, a coin that should have been marked, but was not, a coin that spent decades pretending to be something it was not, and that only reveals its true identity to those who know exactly where to look and exactly what they are looking for. If you ever have the chance to examine a 1941 wheat penny closely, take a moment to look below the date. Most of the time, you will see nothing, and that nothing will mean Philadelphia, and it will be worth a few cents. But just maybe, if you are lucky, and if you are paying attention, that nothing will mean something else entirely. It will mean San Francisco. It will mean a mistake in a die room more than 80 years ago. And it will mean you are holding one of the rarest and most quietly remarkable coins in all of American numismatics. The coin you are looking at right now, under soft studio lighting, is a 1945 Lincoln wheat penny with no mint mark. It is small, copper-brown, unassuming, the kind of coin that most people would glance at once and then set aside without a second thought. It weighs about 3 grams. It measures 19 millimeters across. It is made of bronze, 95% copper with traces of tin and zinc. It has Abraham Lincoln's profile on the front, the words "In God We Trust" curving across the top, liberty on the left, and the date 1941 on the right. On the back, 2 wheat stalks frame the words 1 cent and United States of America, with E pluribus unum arched across the top. It looks like any other wheat penny from the 1940s. But this coin is far from ordinary, because the year stamped on its face, 1945, is perhaps the most historically significant year in modern American history, and the story of how this coin came to be, what was happening in the country when it was struck, and why it exists in the form it does, is a story that reaches into the very heart of the American experience during the Second World War. To understand this coin, you have to understand the America that produced it, and that America was a nation transformed, a nation in the final, most intense, most painful, and most triumphant months of the greatest conflict in human history. Let us set the scene. It is January of 1945. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is President of the United States. He has been president for over 12 years, longer than any person in American history. He was first elected in 1932, at the depth of the Great Depression, when unemployment was near 25%, banks were failing by the thousands, and millions of Americans were destitute. Through the New Deal, through programs like the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Social Security Act, the Tennessee Valley Authority, Roosevelt had reshaped the relationship between the federal government and the American people, creating a safety net where none had existed and putting millions of people back to work. But the New Deal did not fully end the Depression. What ended the Depression was war. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, pulled the United States into a global conflict that had been raging since 1939, and by 1945, the American economy had been completely reorganized around the war effort. Factories that had been making automobiles were making tanks. Factories that had been making refrigerators were making artillery shells. Factories that had been making typewriters were making machine guns. The entire industrial capacity of the United States, the largest and most productive in the world, had been redirected toward a single purpose: winning the war. By early 1945, the United States was producing at a scale that defies comprehension. In the previous year alone, American factories had produced over 96,000 aircraft, over 21,000 tanks and armored vehicles, and over 8,000 naval vessels of all types. The economy was running at full capacity, and then some. Unemployment had effectively vanished. The unemployment rate in 1944 was about 1.2%, the lowest in American history. Millions of women had entered the industrial workforce for the first time, taking jobs in factories and shipyards that had previously been closed to them, symbolized by the iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter. African Americans were migrating from the rural South to industrial cities in the North and West, in what historians call the Second Great Migration, seeking war industry jobs and a chance to escape the Jim Crow South, though they still faced discrimination and segregation in both the workplace and the military. The country was united in a way that it had rarely been united before or since, bound together by a common purpose and a shared sense of urgency, because the war was not yet won, and the cost of winning it was staggering. The human cost was immense. By the start of 1945, over 400,000 American servicemen had already been killed in the war, and more would die before it was over. In the Pacific Theater, American forces were fighting their way through a series of brutal island campaigns against Japanese forces that resisted with extraordinary ferocity. The Battle of Iwo Jima began on February 19, 1945, and would last over a month, costing nearly 7,000 American lives and wounding nearly 20,000 more. The Battle of Okinawa, which began on April 1, 1945, would be even bloodier, with over 12,000 Americans killed and tens of thousands wounded, along with an estimated 100,000 Japanese soldiers and as many as 100,000 Okinawan civilians. These were not distant, abstract events. They were happening right now, while this coin was being struck. Every American knew someone who was serving overseas. Every American had a son, a brother, a husband, a neighbor, a co-worker who was in the fight. The war was personal in a way that is almost impossible to fully appreciate from the distance of 80 years. In the European theater, the situation was reaching its climax. The Allied invasion of Normandy had taken place on June 6, 1944, and American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces had been fighting their way across France and into Germany ever since. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, had been fought in December 1944 and January 1945, in the freezing cold of the Ardennes forest, and had cost nearly 90,000 American casualties. By early 1945, Allied forces were crossing the Rhine and advancing into Germany itself. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, having already liberated much of Poland and approaching Berlin. The end of the war in Europe was in sight, but it was not yet at hand, and the fighting remained intense. American soldiers were still dying every day, and the nation held its collective breath, listening to the radio for news from the front, reading the casualty lists in the local papers, dreading the telegram from the War Department that every family with a serviceman feared. And then, on April 12, 1945, the news came, not from the battlefield, but from a small town in Georgia. Franklin Roosevelt was dead. He had traveled to Warm Springs, Georgia, his retreat where he had gone for decades to seek treatment and relief from the polio that had paralyzed his legs since 1921. He had been in declining health for months, though the public did not fully know how serious his condition was. On that afternoon, while sitting for a portrait, he complained of a terrible headache, slumped forward, and lost consciousness. He had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He died later that day. He was 63 years old. The nation was stunned. Roosevelt had been president for so long that many Americans could not remember a time when he had not been their leader. He had guided them through the Depression and through the war, and now, with victory in sight but not yet achieved, he was gone. Harry Truman, the vice president who had been on the job for only 82 days and who had been kept almost entirely in the dark about the most sensitive aspects of the war effort, including the Manhattan Project, was suddenly president of the United States. The country reeled from the shock, but did not stop. The factories did not stop. The soldiers did not stop fighting, and the mint did not stop making coins. This is the America of 1945. A nation at war, a nation in mourning, a nation on the cusp of the most consequential months of the 20th century. And in the middle of all of this, the United States Mint was doing its quiet, essential work, producing the coins that kept the everyday economy functioning. The Mint, like every other government agency, had been affected by the war. Its workforce had changed as men left for military service and women took their places on the production floor. Its metal supplies had been disrupted by wartime demands, and this had already led to one of the most dramatic changes in American coinage history. To understand the 1945 cent, you have to understand what happened to the cent in 1943, because the story of the 1945 penny is inseparable from the story of the 1943 steel penny, and that story is one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of American money. In 1942, the United States was fully engaged in a war that required vast quantities of copper. Copper was essential for the war effort because it was used in the production of brass, which is an alloy of copper and zinc, and bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin. Brass was used in enormous quantities for cartridge cases, artillery shells, naval fittings, electrical wiring, communication equipment, and countless other military applications. Every bullet fired by an American soldier required a brass cartridge case. Every artillery shell fired by an American battery required a larger brass case. The military's demand for copper was so enormous that it threatened to outstrip the available supply, and the government began looking for ways to conserve copper in non-military applications. One of the applications they examined was the 1-cent coin. The Lincoln cent had been made of bronze since 1909, a composition of 95% copper and 5% tin and zinc. Over 1 billion cents were being produced annually by the early 1940s, and each one contained about 3 grams of copper. 1 billion cents meant roughly 3,000 metric tons of copper per year, and the War Production Board determined that this copper could be better used in the war effort. The decision was made to change the composition of the cent for the duration of the war. In 1943, the mint produced Lincoln cents made of zinc-coated steel rather than bronze. These steel cents were silvery white in color, lighter than the bronze cents, and they were magnetically attracted, which was a new characteristic for American cents. They were produced in enormous quantities, over 1 billion of them, at all 3 mints, Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco, but the steel cent was deeply unpopular with the public. People confused them with dimes because of their silvery color. They were prone to rusting because the zinc coating was thin and easily worn through, exposing the steel underneath to moisture and air. Vending machines did not always accept them because their magnetic properties and different weight caused problems with the mechanical sorting mechanisms. The public called them lead pennies, steelies, and other unflattering names, and there was widespread pressure to return to the familiar bronze cent. By 1944, the War Production Board had reassessed the copper situation. The military's copper needs were still enormous, but the conservation efforts of the previous 2 years had helped, and the supply situation had improved enough to allow a return to bronze for the cent. However, there was a twist. The mint did not return to using newly mined copper for the cents. Instead, they used salvaged copper, specifically copper recovered from used artillery shell casings that were being collected from battlefields and training ranges and shipped back to the United States for recycling. These shell casings were made of brass, which is copper and zinc, and the mint was able to melt them down, adjust the alloy composition by adding tin and additional copper and zinc as needed, and produce bronze planchets that were close to the original pre-war composition. The exact formulation was approximately 95% copper and 5% zinc, with tin eliminated or present only in trace amounts, which technically made these cents brass rather than true bronze, but the difference was subtle enough that the coins looked and felt like the pre-war cents, and the public accepted them without complaint. These shell-case cents were produced in 1944 and 1945, and they represent a remarkable physical connection between the battlefield and the pocket change of ordinary Americans. When you hold a 1945 cent in your hand, you may well be holding metal that was once part of an artillery shell fired in combat during the Second World War. The copper in this coin may have traveled across the Atlantic, been loaded into a howitzer in France or Italy, been fired at enemy positions, been collected afterward, shipped back across the ocean, melted down, and reformed into a 1-cent coin. That is an extraordinary provenance for a humble penny, and it is one of the reasons why collectors of all levels find the 1945 cent so compelling. Now, let us talk about the mint itself in 1945. The United States Mint in 1945 consisted of 3 operating facilities: the main mint in Philadelphia, the branch mint in Denver, and the branch mint in San Francisco. There was also an assay office in New York and other facilities, but the three mints were where coins were actually struck. The Philadelphia Mint was the largest and most productive, responsible for the majority of all coin production in the country. In 1945, the Philadelphia Mint struck over 1 billion Lincoln cents, a staggering number that reflected both the size of the American economy and the fact that coins were being used more intensively than ever. Wartime economic activity was at record levels, with millions of Americans earning wages in war industries and spending them on goods and services, and the demand for small denomination coins, particularly cents and nickels, was enormous. The Denver Mint struck over 260 million cents in 1945, and the San Francisco Mint struck over 180 million. Together, the three mints produced well over 1.4 billion Lincoln cents in that single year, each one a tiny piece of metal that played a role in the daily commerce of a nation at war. The mint mark system worked the same way it had for decades. Coins struck at Philadelphia carried no mint mark by long tradition. Coins struck at Denver carried a small d below the date on the obverse. Coins struck at San Francisco carried a small s in the same position. The mint mark was punched into each working die by hand before the die was hardened, a manual step in an otherwise mechanized process that, as we discussed in our earlier examination of the 1941 no mint mark era, was vulnerable to human mistake. But for the vast majority of 1945 cents, the system worked as intended. Philadelphia cents had no mint mark, Denver cents had a D, and San Francisco cents had an SSO. When we talk about a 1945 wheat penny with no mint mark, we are talking about a coin that at first glance appears to be a standard Philadelphia issue. And in fact, the vast majority of 1945 cents with no mint mark are exactly that, ordinary Philadelphia coins, over 1 billion of them, worth a few cents each in circulated condition. But the coin you are looking at is not one of those ordinary coins. What makes this particular 1945 no mint mark cent rare and valuable is a combination of factors that are unique to the wartime context and the specific conditions under which the mints were operating in 1945. The key to understanding the rarity of the 1945 no mint mark cent lies in the extraordinary pressures under which the mints were operating during the war. Production demands were at unprecedented levels. The workforce was stretched thin, with experienced mint employees having been replaced by newer, less experienced workers, including many women who had never worked in a mint before. The pace of production was relentless, with presses running around the clock in some cases to meet the demand for coinage. Quality control, while still present, was operating under constraints that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Inspectors were fewer, shifts were longer, and the tolerance for minor imperfections was higher because the priority was volume. The mint needed coins in circulation, and it needed them now. Under these conditions, errors that would have been caught and corrected in a more deliberate, less pressured environment slipped through with greater frequency. The specific error that created the rare 1945 no mint mark cent we are examining occurred not at Philadelphia, but at one of the branch mints, most likely San Francisco, where a working die was produced, hardened, and put into service without the mint mark being punched into it. This is the same type of error that created the 1941 no mint mark cent we discussed earlier, but in 1945, the conditions that allowed such an error to occur and go undetected were even more acute. The San Francisco Mint in 1945 was operating under intense wartime pressure. Its workforce had been depleted by military enlistment and the draft. New employees were being trained on the job, learning the die-making process, the mint mark punching process, the inspection process, all while trying to keep up with production quotas that were higher than they had ever been. The die room was a bottleneck in the production chain because every die had to be produced, inspected, punched with a mint mark, hardened, and dispatched to the press room, and the demand for new dies was constant. Under these conditions, it is entirely plausible that a die could move through the process without receiving its mint mark, especially if the person responsible for the punching step was new, or was covering for someone else, or was working under such time pressure that they simply missed one die in the rush. There is also another possibility that has been discussed by numismatists, which is that the error occurred at the Denver Mint rather than San Francisco. The Denver Mint was also under wartime pressure, and the same type of mistake, a die leaving the die room without its D mint mark, could have occurred there. Without definitive die analysis, it can be difficult to determine which branch mint produced a given no mint mark error coin, and this ambiguity is part of what makes the 1945 no mint mark cent such a challenging and fascinating variety to study. What is certain is that the coin was not produced at Philadelphia, because if it had been, it would not be an error at all. It would simply be one of over 1 billion ordinary cents. The rarity comes from the fact that this coin was struck at a branch mint, using a die that should have carried a mint mark, but did not, and the only way to distinguish it from a Philadelphia coin is through careful analysis of die characteristics that are specific to the branch mint that produced it. Identifying these die characteristics requires expertise and patience. The first step is to examine the area below the date on the obverse under magnification. On a genuine branch mint no mint mark error, the field below the date should be completely clean, with no trace of a D or an S, no partial impression, no ghost, no artifact of any kind. If you see even the faintest remnant of a mint mark, the coin is not a no mint mark error, it is simply a weakly struck or filled mint mark variety, which is far more common and far less valuable. The field must be absolutely bare. But again, so must the field on a Philadelphia coin, so this test alone is not sufficient. The next step is to look at the overall characteristics of the strike. Branch mint coins in 1945, particularly those from San Francisco, often had a slightly different appearance from Philadelphia coins. The strike might be marginally softer in certain areas, particularly in the finer details of Lincoln's hair and the wheat stalks on the reverse. The metal flow patterns, the way the metal was pushed into the deepest recesses of the die, can differ slightly between mints due to variations in press setup, striking pressure, and die preparation. An experienced numismatist can sometimes identify these subtle differences and use them as evidence that a coin was struck at a branch mint rather than at Philadelphia. Beyond these general characteristics, the most reliable method of attribution is to identify the specific working die that produced the coin. Every working die has unique microscopic features, tiny imperfections in the steel that are transferred to every coin the die strikes. These can include die polishing lines, which are fine scratches left in the die face when the die was polished or cleaned during preparation. They can include die chips, which are small pieces of metal that break out of the die face during use, leaving tiny raised lumps on the coins. They can include die cracks, which are fractures that develop in the die under the stress of repeated striking, leaving raised lines on the coins. Every die develops its own unique pattern of these features over its working life. And if numismatists have documented the specific die that produced the 1945 no mint mark error, they can compare a candidate coin against that documentation and make a definitive attribution. This is painstaking work, requiring high magnification photography, side-by-side comparison with known examples, and often consultation with other specialists. It is the kind of work that professional grading services like PCGS and NGC are equipped to do, and for this reason, any collector who believes they have found a 1945 no mint mark branch mint error should submit the coin for professional authentication rather than relying on their own assessment. Now, let us talk about how many of these coins are believed to exist today. Total number of coins struck from the error die is unknown, but based on what we know about die life in the 1940s, it could have been anywhere from a few tens of thousands to perhaps over 100,000. However, the number that survived today is a tiny fraction of that. These coins entered circulation in 1945 and were completely indistinguishable from the over 1 billion Philadelphia cents produced that same year. Nobody was looking for them. Nobody was pulling them aside. They were spent, lost, damaged, worn smooth, and in many cases destroyed. The survival rate for Lincoln cents from the 1940s in collectible condition is low because these coins were used hard in everyday commerce and remained in circulation for many years, accumulating wear and damage. The vast majority of 1945 cents that survive today are in circulated condition, showing significant wear, and they are worth only a few cents each. But among those survivors, the number of genuine branch mint no mint mark errors that have been definitively identified and authenticated is believed to be extremely small, perhaps fewer than 24 certified examples across all grades, and possibly fewer than that. The exact number is difficult to pin down because new examples may still be discovered, sitting unrecognized in collections or in rolls of old cents that have never been carefully examined. But as of now, the population of authenticated 1945 no-mint mark branch mint errors is believed to be in the low dozens at most, making this one of the rarest and most sought-after varieties in the entire Lincoln cent series. The value of this coin depends heavily on its condition and on whether it has been professionally authenticated. In the lowest collectible grades, meaning good 4 or very good 8, where the coin is heavily worn and the design is significantly flattened, a certified 1945 branch mint no-mint mark error might sell for somewhere in the range of $200 to $500 at auction. In fine condition, where the coin shows moderate wear but retains more visible detail, the value might range from $500 to $1,000. In very fine condition, where the wear is lighter and more of the original design is visible, the value could be in the range of $1,000 to $2,000. In extremely fine condition, where the coin shows only light wear on the highest points and most details are sharp and clear, the value might climb to between $2,000 and $4,000. In about uncirculated condition, where the coin retains nearly all of its original detail with only the faintest trace of wear, the value could be in the range of $4,000 to $7,000. In true mint state condition, where the coin has never been circulated and retains its original mint luster, the value increases dramatically. An MS-60 or MS-61 example, which is uncirculated but may have significant contact marks or a weak strike, might sell for $7,000 to $12,000. An MS-63 example, with fewer marks and better eye appeal, could bring $12,000 to $20,000. An MS-64, with strong luster and relatively few marks, could command $20,000 to $35,000 or more. And in MS-65 or higher, with full original luster, minimal contact marks, and exceptional eye appeal, the value could potentially exceed $50,000, although examples at this grade level are so rare that establishing a reliable market price is extremely difficult. If a gem uncirculated example were to appear at a major auction today, the final price would depend on the intensity of bidding among serious variety collectors, and it could go significantly higher. It is important to emphasize again that these values apply only to coins that have been definitively attributed as branch mint no-mint mark errors through professional authentication. A raw, uncertified coin that appears to be a no-mint mark error will always sell for far less than a certified example, because buyers cannot be confident in the attribution without expert verification. And the vast majority of 1945 cents with no mint mark are simply Philadelphia coins worth a few cents. The error is real, but it is rare, and the difference between a common Philadelphia cent and a rare branch mint error is something that only an expert with the right reference materials and equipment can reliably determine. The story of this coin is, in the end, the story of a nation. It is the story of a country that was fighting the largest war in human history, a country that was producing weapons and ships and aircraft in unimaginable quantities, a country that had lost its president just months before victory, a country that was melting down artillery shell casings from distant battlefields and turning them into pennies for everyday commerce. It is the story of a mint that was under extraordinary pressure, staffed by workers who were new to the job and working around the clock, trying to produce over 1 billion coins in a single year while the world was falling apart and then being put back together. And it is the story of a tiny mistake, a missing letter on a steel die, a letter that should have been there but was not, a letter whose absence turned an ordinary penny into something rare and precious and deeply connected to the most dramatic moment in American history. When you hold this coin, you are holding a piece of 1945. You are holding metal that may have been fired in anger across a European battlefield or a Pacific island. You are holding the product of a workforce that included women who had never before been allowed to work in a mint, working alongside men who were too old or too young for military service, all of them doing their part. You are holding a coin that was minted in the same year that the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that signed the United Nations Charter in San Francisco, that celebrated VE Day in May and VJ Day in September, that began the transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy, that started to imagine what the post-war world would look like. And you are holding a coin that, through a small human error in a busy die room, became something its makers never intended, a rarity, a mystery, a treasure that hides in plain sight, waiting for someone with the knowledge and the patience to look closely enough to see what is really there. That is the 1945 no-mint-mark wheat penny. That is the story in your hand. The coin resting on the table in front of me right now is a 1946 Lincoln wheat penny bearing the S mint mark, struck at the San Francisco Mint, and it is one of the most aesthetically rich and historically layered coins in the entire Lincoln cent series. Now I know what some of you are already thinking. A wheat penny from 1946, how rare can that really be? The mintage figures are not exactly microscopic. The San Francisco Mint produced well over 190 million Lincoln cents in 1946, and that is a substantial number by any measure. But rarity in numismatics is not always about how many coins were struck. Sometimes it is about how many survived in a condition worth owning, and sometimes it is about the artistry behind the coin, the human story embedded in every line and curve of its design, and the way that design itself, through its beauty and its complexity, created a standard that most surviving examples simply cannot meet. That is the story of this coin. It is a story about an artist, about a design that was revolutionary in its time, about a mint that was transitioning from wartime production back to peacetime operations, and about a specific year and a specific mint mark that together created a coin whose finest examples are among the most coveted and elusive in all of American coin collecting. So let us begin where every great coin begins, with the person who made it beautiful. The design of the Lincoln cent, both the obverse portrait of Abraham Lincoln and the reverse wheat stalks, was the work of a man named Victor David Brenner. He was born Viktoras Barnauskas in 1871 in the town of Vilnius, which is now the capital of Lithuania, but was then part of the Russian Empire. His family was Jewish, and his father was an engraver and a craftsman who worked with metal and seals and small decorative objects. Young Victor grew up watching his father manipulate metal with tools, pressing designs into soft surfaces, creating images from nothing. That childhood exposure to the art of engraving planted a seed that would eventually grow into one of the most important careers in the history of American numismatic art. But the path from Vilnius to the United States Mint was neither straight nor easy. Brenner immigrated to the United States in 1890, arriving as a young man of 19 with very little money, no formal artistic credentials, and a deep talent that had not yet been fully shaped or recognized. He settled in New York City, where the streets were crowded with immigrants from every corner of Europe, where the art world was vibrant and competitive, and where a young engraver could find work if he was skilled and persistent and willing to start at the bottom. Brenner found employment in a variety of workshops and engraving shops, doing practical commercial work, cutting dies for seals, making medals for events and organizations, honing his craft through repetition and practice. He was largely self-taught as an artist, though he later studied at the Art Students League in New York and also spent time in Paris, where he attended the Académie Julian, one of the most respected art schools in France. Paris at the turn of the century was the center of the art world, and Brenner's time there exposed him to the European tradition of medallic art, which was far more developed and respected than the American tradition at that time. In France, medallic art was treated as a fine art form on par with painting and sculpture. Medallists like Louis-Oscar Roti and Jules Clement Chaplin were creating works of extraordinary beauty and refinement, and their influence on Brenner was profound. He learned from the French school the importance of deep relief, of modeling forms in 3 dimensions, of treating a small metal disc as a canvas for sculptural expression rather than merely a surface for stamping letters and numbers. This European training, this understanding that a coin or a medal could be a work of art, not just a utilitarian object, would become the foundation of everything Brenner did when he eventually received the commission that would define his legacy. After returning to the United States from Paris, Brenner established himself as a medalist and sculptor in New York. He created medals for various clients, including universities, societies, and private individuals. His work was characterized by a remarkable sensitivity to the human face, an ability to capture not just the physical likeness of a subject, but something of the inner life, the character, the weight of the person's experience. This was unusual in American medallic art at the time, which tended toward a more stiff, formal, almost mechanical style. Brenner's portraits breathed. They had warmth and dimension, and a quality of presence that made the subject feel alive rather than merely represented. It was this quality that caught the attention of the most powerful art patron in the United States, President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt had been elected president in 1901 following the assassination of William McKinley, and he had brought to the White House a passionate belief that American coinage was ugly and needed to be made beautiful. He had already commissioned the sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens to redesign the $10 and $20 gold pieces, resulting in some of the most magnificent coins ever produced by the United States Mint. But Roosevelt was not satisfied with reforming only the gold coins. He wanted the everyday coins, the coins that ordinary Americans carried in their pockets, to be beautiful as well, and he had a specific idea in mind. The year 1909 would mark the centennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth, and Roosevelt, who admired Lincoln deeply, wanted to honor that anniversary by placing Lincoln's portrait on a circulating coin. No real person had ever appeared on a circulating United States coin before. The tradition, going back to the founding of the Republic, had been to use allegorical female figures representing liberty or Native American imagery or symbolic designs like eagles and wreaths. The Founding Fathers had been deliberately opposed to placing living or recent historical figures on coins, partly because they associated that practice with monarchy, with the faces of kings and queens stamped on the currency of European nations. Roosevelt was consciously breaking with that tradition, and he needed an artist who could capture Lincoln's face with the dignity and the humanity that the subject demanded. The story of how Roosevelt found Brenner has been told in several slightly different versions, but the essential facts are clear. Roosevelt was attending a reception or an event where he saw a bronze plaque or medal that Brenner had created depicting Abraham Lincoln in profile. The plaque was based on a photograph taken by Anthony Berger in 1864 at the Matthew Brady Studio in Washington, showing Lincoln facing right. Brenner had studied this photograph intently and had translated it into a sculptural relief that captured the planes and angles of Lincoln's face with extraordinary fidelity and feeling. Roosevelt was struck by the quality of the work. He asked who had made it, was told it was Brenner, and reportedly said something to the effect that this was the man who should design the new Lincoln coin. The commission was essentially decided in that moment, though the formal process of engaging Brenner and approving the design would take some time and involve several rounds of review and revision. Brenner was thrilled and also daunted by the assignment. He understood that he was being asked to do something unprecedented, to create the first coin in United States history to bear the portrait of a real person, and that the person was Abraham Lincoln, a figure who had achieved almost mythic status in the American consciousness by that time. Lincoln had been dead for over 40 years, but his legacy had only grown. He was the man who had preserved the Union during the Civil War, who had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, who had been assassinated at the moment of victory. He was a martyr, a saint, a secular icon, capturing his face on a coin that would be held by millions of people, that would pass through every hand in the country, was an artistic responsibility of the highest order, and Brenner approached it with the seriousness it deserved. He began by studying every available image of Lincoln. The Anthony Berger photograph from 1864 was his primary source, but he also examined other Brady photographs, life masks, and written descriptions of Lincoln's appearance. He was particularly attentive to the structure of Lincoln's face, the deep-set eyes, the prominent cheekbones, the strong jaw, the slightly asymmetrical mouth that gave his expression its characteristic blend of melancholy and resolve. Lincoln's face was not conventionally handsome. It was long, angular, weathered by years of hardship and sorrow. But it had a nobility and a gravity that Brenner was determined to capture, not by idealizing or softening the features, but by rendering them as truthfully as possible, because it was the truth of Lincoln's face, the honest representation of a real human being who had carried an impossible burden, that gave the portrait its power. The obverse design that Brenner created shows Lincoln in profile, facing to the right, which is to say the viewer's left. The portrait is in relatively high relief for a circulating coin, meaning that the image of Lincoln rises noticeably from the surface of the coin, giving it a sculptural quality that is immediately apparent when you hold the coin and tilt it in the light. The detail in the portrait is remarkable for a coin of this size, which is only 19 millimeters in diameter. Lincoln's hair is rendered with individual strands and waves visible, not merely suggested, but actually articulated, each lock of hair having its own direction and texture. The eyebrow is a distinct ridge above the eye, not a flat line, but a three-dimensional form that casts its own shadow. The eye itself is deeply set, with the eyelid and the corner of the eye clearly defined, and the pupil suggested by a subtle depression in the metal. The nose is long and straight, with the nostril indicated and the bridge showing the slight irregularity that characterized Lincoln's actual nose. The mouth is perhaps the most expressive element of the portrait. Lincoln's lips are slightly parted, and there is the faintest suggestion of an expression that is neither a smile nor a frown but something in between, a look of quiet contemplation of a man who is thinking, who is carrying the weight of decisions that will affect millions of lives. The chin is strong and clearly defined, with the line of the jaw running back to the ear, which is rendered with enough detail to show the inner structure of the helix and the lobe. The neck rises from the bottom of the coin, and Lincoln is wearing a jacket with a collar and a shirt with a tie or cravat, the folds of the fabric indicated by lines that follow the natural draping of the cloth. Surrounding the portrait is a border of text that follows the curve of the coin. Across the top, arching from approximately the 10 o'clock position to the 2 o'clock position, are the words "In God We Trust." This motto had appeared on United States coins since 1864, when it was first placed on the 2-cent piece during the Civil War at the urging of Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase, who had been moved by letters from clergy and citizens requesting that the nation acknowledge the divine on its coinage. Brenner placed the motto in letters that are small but clear, with each letter individually formed and spaced, following the curve of the rim with precision. On the left side of the coin, running vertically downward from approximately the 8 o'clock position, is the word liberty. This word, perhaps the single most important concept in the American political tradition, had appeared on virtually every United States coin since the earliest days of the Republic, and Brenner gave it a prominent position, with letters that are slightly larger than those in the motto above. On the right side, running vertically downward from approximately the 4 o'clock position, is the date, in this case 1946, and directly below the date, in a smaller font, is the S mint mark that identifies this coin as a product of the San Francisco Mint. The mint mark is a small letter S, and on a well-struck example, it is crisp and clear, with serifs visible if you examine it under magnification. The position of the mint mark, directly below the date and slightly to the right, is consistent with the standard placement used on Lincoln cents from branch mints throughout the series. Now let us turn the coin over and examine the reverse, because the reverse design is every bit as important as the obverse, and is, in many ways, more innovative and more personal to Brenner as an artist. The reverse of the Lincoln cent features 2 stalks of wheat, one on the left and one on the right, arranged vertically along the edges of the coin, with their heads, the grain-bearing tips, curving inward toward the top center of the design. Between the wheat stalks, arranged in 3 horizontal lines, are the words 1 cent on the top line, United States of America on the middle line, and E pluribus unum on the bottom line. Arched across the top of the coin, above the wheat heads, is nothing. The top is open, with the wheat heads themselves filling the space. At the bottom center, below the text, the 2 wheat stalks are bound together by what appears to be a band or a ribbon, creating a visual unity that ties the 2 sides of the design together. The wheat stalks themselves are extraordinary pieces of miniature sculpture. Each stalk is rendered with a level of botanical detail that is unusual for a circulating coin. The stem of each wheat plant is a long, slightly curving line that runs from the bottom of the coin to approximately the 2/3 mark, where it transitions into the head of the wheat. Along the stem, Brenner placed small, short lines representing the leaves of the wheat plant, each leaf angled slightly away from the stem, giving the impression of a living plant rather than a stylized symbol. The head of each wheat stalk, the part that carries the grain, is rendered as a series of small, overlapping, teardrop-shaped forms arranged in a dense cluster along the top portion of the stem. These are the individual grains or kernels of wheat, and Brenner modeled each one with a slight ridge down the center and a pointed tip, giving them texture and dimension. The heads curve inward, toward each other, creating a sense of symmetry and balance, and the long, thin bristles called awns that extend from the tips of the grain heads reach upward and outward, filling the upper portion of the reverse with a delicate, feathery pattern that is among the most beautiful and most challenging elements of the design to strike up fully on an actual coin. The choice of wheat as the reverse motif was Brenner's, and it was a meaningful one. Wheat had been used as a symbol of agriculture, of abundance, of the fruitfulness of the land, in art and iconography for thousands of years, going back to ancient Greek and Roman coinage, where grain sheaves and wheat heads appeared as attributes of Demeter and Ceres, the goddesses of agriculture. By placing wheat on the reverse of the Lincoln cent, Brenner was connecting the American coin to this ancient tradition while also giving it a specifically American resonance. Wheat was the crop of the American heartland, the crop of the prairies and the plains, the crop that fed the nation and that Lincoln himself had known growing up in the rural Midwest. The wheat reverse thus created a thematic link between the man on the obverse, the rail splitter, the prairie lawyer, the son of the frontier, and the land that had produced him. It was a design that said something about America and about Lincoln's place in the American story, and it did so not through heavy-handed symbolism, but through the simple, elegant image of two stalks of grain. The text on the reverse is arranged with careful attention to spacing and proportion. The words 1 cent are in the largest font, occupying the top line between the wheat stalks, and they are the most immediately legible element when you glance at the reverse. Below them, United States of America is in a slightly smaller font, spanning a wider portion of the available space, with each word clearly separated and the letters evenly spaced. Below that, E pluribus unum, the Latin motto meaning out of many, one, is in the smallest font, occupying the narrowest portion of the space between the stalks. The arrangement creates a visual hierarchy, with the denomination, the most practical piece of information on the coin, given the most prominence, the nation's name given secondary prominence, and the motto given a smaller, more intimate position. The overall effect is one of balance and order, with the text framed by the wheat-like words inscribed on a scroll or a tablet held by the grain itself. Now, the reason I have spent so much time describing the design in such detail is that the design itself is directly connected to the rarity and desirability of the 1946 S in particular. Here is why. The Lincoln cent design, as I have described, is rich in fine detail. The individual strands of Lincoln's hair, the delicate awns of the wheat heads, the fine lines of the leaves, the small letters of the motto, all of these elements require a precise, forceful strike to be fully rendered on the finished coin. If the striking pressure is insufficient, or if the die is worn, or if the planchet is not perfectly prepared, these fine details will be missing or muted. The hair will appear flat rather than textured. The wheat awns will be incomplete or invisible. The letters will be soft rather than sharp. And this is exactly what happened at the San Francisco Mint in 1946. The San Francisco Mint in 1946 was in a state of transition. The war had ended in August and September of 1945 with the Japanese surrender, and the country was beginning the enormous task of converting from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. The mint was no longer under the same extreme production pressure it had faced during the war years, but it was still dealing with the aftermath of that pressure. Equipment had been run hard and was showing wear. The workforce was changing again as veterans returned, and as some of the women who had filled wartime positions moved on to other jobs or were let go. The supply chains for materials, including the bronze alloy used for cent planchets, were in flux as the military released its claims on copper and the mint transitioned away from the recycled shell-case brass that had been used in 1944 and 1945 back toward a more standard bronze composition. All of this meant that the San Francisco Mint in 1946 was not operating at peak efficiency or peak precision. The coins it produced, while perfectly serviceable for circulation, were often not as sharply struck as the coins produced at the Philadelphia Mint. The details that Brenner had so carefully sculpted into his design, the fine hair lines, the delicate wheat awns, the crisp lettering, were frequently muted or incomplete on San Francisco cents from this period. This is where the rarity comes in. A 1946 cent in circulated condition is not a rare coin. Millions of them survive, and they can be found in almost any coin shop or junk bin for a few cents. But a 1946 cent in uncirculated condition, with full original mint luster and a sharp, complete strike that renders every detail of Brenner's design, is a genuinely rare coin. The combination of circumstances at the San Francisco Mint in 1946, the worn equipment, the transitional workforce, the variable planchet quality, the less than optimal striking pressure, meant that only a small percentage of the coins produced there that year were struck well enough to show the full beauty of the design. And of those well-struck coins, only a tiny fraction were preserved in uncirculated condition, saved by someone who recognized their quality and set them aside rather than spending them. The result is that the 1946 is one of the most conditionally rare coins in the entire Lincoln Wheat Cent series. In grades below very fine, it is common and inexpensive. In very fine and extremely fine, it becomes moderately scarcer and begins to carry a modest premium. But in mint state, particularly in the higher mint state grades, it becomes genuinely rare, and in the finest grades, with full red luster and a full sharp strike, it is among the most valuable and most sought-after coins in the series. The design itself, with its demand for precise striking to render its fine details, is what creates this conditional rarity. A simpler design, with fewer fine details, would not show the effects of a weak strike as dramatically, and the difference between a well-struck and a poorly struck example would be less significant. But Brenner's design, with its intricate hair and its feathery wheat awns and its tiny motto letters, punishes a weak strike and rewards a strong one, and the market has responded accordingly. Let me describe what a collector should look for when examining a 1946 cent, starting with the obverse. The first thing to examine is Lincoln's hair. On a fully struck example, you should be able to see individual strands and waves of hair, particularly around the temple and the back of the head, where the hair is longest and most complex. The hair should have texture and dimension, not a flat, uniform surface. If the hair appears smooth and undifferentiated, the strike is weak, and the coin will not command a premium. Next, look at the eyebrow. On a well-struck coin, the eyebrow is a distinct ridge that stands above the plane of the forehead, casting a visible shadow when you tilt the coin. On a weakly struck coin, the eyebrow blends into the forehead and is barely distinguishable. Then look at the eye. The eyelid and the inner corner of the eye should be clearly defined on a strong strike, with the pupil suggested by a subtle concavity in the metal. On a weak strike, the eye is a flat, featureless area. Move down to the mouth and chin. The lips should be distinct and slightly parted, and the chin should have a clear, sharp lower edge. If the chin blends into the neck without a defined edge, the strike is soft. Now look at the wheat stalks on the reverse. This is where the strike quality is most critical and most easily assessed. The individual grains in the wheat heads should be separate and distinct, each one visible as a small, pointed form with a ridge down its center. On a weakly struck coin, the grains merge into a single, lumpy mass with no individual definition. The awns, the thin bristles extending from the tops of the grain heads, are the most demanding element of the design and the most reliable indicator of strike quality. On a fully struck coin, the awns are visible as thin, separate lines radiating upward from the grain heads, filling the space between the wheat and the top of the coin. On even a slightly weak strike, the awns are incomplete, broken, or entirely absent. A 1946 with full, complete wheat awns is a genuinely rare coin, and this single feature can dramatically affect the value. Also examine the letters in E pluribus unum. On a strong strike, each letter is sharp and clear with well-defined edges. On a weak strike, the letters are rounded and soft, particularly the smaller letters in the motto. Finally, examine the overall surface of the coin for contact marks, which are the small nicks and scratches that result from coins banging against each other during production and handling. In the higher mint state grades, the number and severity of contact marks becomes the primary determinant of grade, with fewer and less visible marks commanding higher grades and higher prices. Now let us talk about the color of the coin, because color is a critical factor in the value of any bronze or copper Lincoln cent, and the 1946 S is no exception. When a bronze cent is first struck, it has a bright, vivid, coppery red color that is the natural color of the freshly exposed alloy. Over time, exposure to air, moisture, and handling causes the copper to oxidize, and the color changes from red to red-brown to eventually brown. The rate of this color change depends on how the coin has been stored. A coin that has been kept in an airtight container, away from moisture and atmospheric pollutants, may retain its red color for decades or even longer. A coin that has been exposed to the air, or that has been handled with bare fingers, or that has been stored in a humid environment, will turn brown much more quickly. The grading services recognize 3 color designations for copper cents. RD, which stands for red, means that the coin retains at least approximately 85% of its original red color across both surfaces. RB, which stands for red-brown, means that the coin shows a mixture of red and brown, with the red color covering between approximately 20 and 85% of the surface. BN, which stands for brown, means that the coin has less than approximately 20% of its original red color remaining and is predominantly brown. For the 1946 S, the color designation has an enormous impact on value. A brown uncirculated example is worth significantly less than a red-brown example, and a red example is worth dramatically more, because finding a 1946 S that has retained its full original red color over a span of 80 years is extremely difficult. Most surviving uncirculated examples have toned to some degree, and fully red examples are a small minority of the uncirculated population. So how many 1946 S cents are believed to exist in collectible condition, and what are they worth? In circulated condition, the coin is common. Tens of millions of examples survive in grades from good through extremely fine, and they trade for modest amounts. In good for condition, the lowest collectible grade, where the coin is heavily worn and the design is significantly flattened, a 1946 S might sell for 10 to 20 cents. In very good 8, where more detail is visible but the wear is still substantial, the value might be 20 to 40 cents. In fine 12, where moderate wear is evident but more design elements are visible, the value might be 40 to 75 cents. In very fine 20, where the wear is lighter and more detail is present, the value might be $1 to $2. In extremely fine 40, where only the highest points show wear and most details are sharp, the value might be $3 to $5. In about uncirculated 50, where only the faintest trace of wear is visible on the highest points, the value might be $8 to $15. In about uncirculated 55, with even less wear, the value might be $15 to $25. These are modest numbers, reflecting the fact that the coin is not rare in circulated grades, but when we cross the threshold into mint state, the picture changes dramatically. An MS-60 brown example, uncirculated, but with significant contact marks and no remaining red color, might sell for $30 to $50. An MS-63 brown example, with fewer marks and better eye appeal, might sell for $75 to $150. An MS-63 red-brown example, with some original red color remaining, might sell for $150 to $300. An MS-63 red example, with full original red color, might sell for $300 to $600. Moving up to MS-64, a brown example might sell for $100 to $200, a red-brown might sell for $300 to $500, and a red might sell for $700 to $1,000. At MS-65, the coin becomes genuinely scarce. An MS-65 brown might sell for $200 to $400, a red-brown might sell for $500 to $1,000, and a red might sell for $1,500 to $3,000. At MS-66, the population drops sharply. An MS-66 brown might sell for $400 to $700, a red-brown might sell for $1,000 to $2,000, and a red might sell for $3,000 to $6,000 or more. At MS67, we enter territory where only a handful of examples are known to exist. An MS67 red-brown might sell for $3,000 to $6,000, and an MS67 red, if one could be found, might sell for $10,000 to $20,000 or more. The finest known examples in MS68 with full red color are virtually non-existent. If an MS68 red 1946S were to appear at auction, it would be a major event in the numismatic world, and the price could potentially exceed $30,000 to $50,000, though the market for such a coin is so thin and so specialized that predicting a precise figure is nearly impossible. The reason for this steep valuation curve is the combination of strike and color that I described earlier. The San Francisco Mint in 1946 produced relatively few fully struck coins, and of those, even fewer were preserved with original red color. The population of coins that satisfy both criteria, full strike and full red, in the higher mint state grades, is tiny. Professional grading service population reports show only a small number of examples certified at MS65 red and above, and the numbers at MS66 and MS67 are in the single digits or low double digits at most. This makes the 1946S one of the key coins in a complete set of Lincoln wheat cents in high grade, and collectors who are assembling such a set often find that this is one of the last coins they are able to acquire, because the supply of high-grade examples is so limited and the demand from set collectors is so consistent. There is one more aspect of this coin that I want to discuss, and that is the question of why the design has endured for so long and why it continues to inspire passion among collectors and non-collectors alike. Brenner's Lincoln cent was first issued in 1909, and the obverse portrait, his portrait, remains on the cent to this day, over a century later. The reverse was changed in 1959 to the Lincoln Memorial design by Frank Gasparo, and has been changed several times since, but the obverse, Brenner's Lincoln, has never been replaced. It is the longest-running coin design in United States history, and it is one of the most recognized images in the world. The reason for its longevity is the quality of the art itself. Brenner created a portrait that is simultaneously realistic and idealized, that captures Lincoln's actual features while also conveying the qualities that Americans have always wanted to see in Lincoln: the strength, the compassion, the resolve, the sorrow. He created a reverse that is simultaneously simple and rich, that uses a familiar natural form, the wheat stalk, to create a composition of balance and beauty that frames the essential text without overwhelming it. The design works at the scale of a coin, which is to say it works at a very small scale, where every line and every curve must earn its place because there is no room for anything extraneous. And it works because Brenner understood, from his training in Paris and from his years of practical experience as a medalist, that a coin is not just a token of value, but a small work of art that will be held and seen by millions of people, and that the artistry of that small object matters, not because anyone will stand in a museum and gaze at it, but because it will be part of the daily visual environment of an entire nation. And a nation that carries beautiful coins in its pockets is a nation that has decided that beauty is not a luxury, but a part of ordinary life. The 1946 wheat penny is a coin that rewards careful looking. In a handful of ordinary circulated examples, it is easy to miss what makes it special. But when you find one that is fully struck, with every strand of Lincoln's hair visible, with every wheat awn reaching upward, with the original copper-red luster glowing across both surfaces, you see what Brenner intended. You see the artistry. You see the care and the skill and the vision that went into every element of the design. And you understand why collectors pursue this coin, why they pay thousands of dollars for the finest examples, and why this small copper-colored disc from a San Francisco mint press in the first year of peace after World War II remains one of the most quietly extraordinary objects in the world of American numismatics. That is the 1946 wheat penny. That is the story in your hand. The coin sitting before you in my hands, catching the light in warm coppery tones, is a 1950 Lincoln wheat penny bearing the D mint mark of the Denver Mint. It looks modest. It looks ordinary. It looks like something you might find between the cushions of an old couch or in the bottom of a jar of pennies that your grandmother kept on her kitchen shelf for as long as you can remember. And in many ways, that ordinariness is exactly the point, because the story of this particular coin is not a story of obvious grandeur or immediate recognition. It is a story of patience, of obscurity, of decades spent in darkness and dust before the world understood what it was. It is a story that begins on a winter morning in Denver, Colorado, in the first weeks of 1950, and that winds its way through junk drawers and estate sales and auction floors and safe deposit boxes across the length and breadth of this country over the course of more than 7 decades. It is a story about how an object can pass through dozens of hands, can be valued and discarded and valued again, can be lost and lost and found, before finally arriving at the place where it was always meant to be. So let us go back to the beginning, to the moment when this coin first existed, and let us follow it forward through time, hand by hand, owner by owner, until we arrive at the present day. The Denver Mint in January of 1950 was a facility in transition. The Great War had been over for more than 4 years, and the country had spent those years adjusting to a peacetime economy that was in some ways more turbulent than the wartime economy had been. The post-war period brought inflation, labor unrest, housing shortages, and a massive reorganization of American industry as factories converted from military production back to consumer goods. The Denver Mint had been through all of this, and by 1950, it was settling into a new rhythm of production that was less frantic than the wartime years, but still substantial. The Mint building itself was a stately structure of Tennessee marble and granite at 320 West Colfax Avenue, originally opened in 1906 as an assay office and converted to a full branch mint in 1906. It had been striking coins for decades, and its presses were well maintained, its workforce experienced and stable compared to the chaotic turnover of the war years. The planchets used for the 1950 cent production were composed of the standard bronze alloy, 95% copper with 5% tin and zinc, the same formulation that had been used before the war and that had been restored after the brief and unpopular experiment with zinc-coated steel in 1943. The dies were prepared using the same hub-and die system that had been in place since the beginning of the Lincoln Cent series, with the master hub created from Victor David Brenner's original design, transferred through master dies and working hubs to the individual working dies that would actually strike the coins. Each Denver die received its D mint mark, punched by hand into the soft steel before hardening, positioned directly below the date on the obverse. First 1950 D cents emerged from the Denver presses in early 1950, and they entered the world without ceremony. They were counted, bagged, sealed, and shipped to Federal Reserve banks and commercial banks across the western and central United States, where they were distributed into general circulation. They were spent on newspapers and candy bars and bus fare and postage stamps. They were dropped into collection plates and parking meters and gumball machines. They were put into cash registers and handed out as change to customers who did not look at them twice. There was no reason for anyone to look at them twice. They were pennies. They were the most common denomination of the most common coin in the most common currency in the country. Nobody in January of 1950 was thinking about the 1950 D cent as a future rarity. Nobody was setting aside rolls of them. Nobody was writing articles about them or publishing monographs about their die characteristics or speculating about their investment potential. They were money, pure and simple, and their purpose was to circulate, and circulate they did. The 1950 D cent, with a total mintage of over 634 million pieces, was one of the most heavily produced coins of the era. It was everywhere. It was in every pocket and every purse and every cash drawer in the country. And because it was everywhere, because it was so common, almost nobody thought to preserve it in uncirculated condition. This is the first and most important fact in the provenance story of this coin, because the rarity of the 1950 D is not a mintage rarity. It is a survival rarity. The coins were made by the hundreds of millions, but the number that was saved in pristine, uncirculated, fully read condition is vanishingly small, and the number that were saved in the very finest grades, with full strike and full luster and virtually no contact marks, is so small that it can be counted on the fingers of one hand. The story of how those few surviving gems made it from the Denver mint presses to the collections where they reside today is a story of luck, of accident, of the quiet decisions of ordinary people who had no idea that they were preserving something that would one day be extraordinary. The first leg of the journey for any coin is from the mint to the bank, and for the vast majority of 1950 cents, this was a short and unremarkable trip. The coins were shipped in canvas bags, 50 cents per bag, to Federal Reserve facilities and commercial banks. From there, they were distributed in rolls to retail businesses or broken down into smaller quantities for individual customers. Most of the coins entered circulation within weeks or months of being struck, and once they were in circulation, they began to wear. Every time a cent changed hands, every time it was dropped into a register or jingled in a pocket with other coins, it accumulated tiny scratches and abrasions on its surfaces. The bright copper-red luster that it had when it left the mint began to fade, first to a reddish brown and then to a dull brown, as the copper oxidized through exposure to air and moisture and the oils on human fingers. Within a year, most 1950 cents looked nothing like they had looked when they were first struck. Within 5 years, they were worn enough that the finer details of the design, the individual strands of Lincoln's hair, the delicate awns of the wheat stalks, were significantly diminished. Within 10 years, many of them were worn smooth enough to be nearly unrecognizable as anything other than old pennies. This was the fate of hundreds of millions of coins, and there is no provenance story for those coins because there is no individuality in them. They were mass-produced, mass-circulated, and mass-destroyed, and their journey ended in a smelting furnace or a coin jar or a crack in a sidewalk somewhere. But a tiny number of 1950 cents did not follow this path. A tiny number was set aside, either by accident or by the deliberate choice of someone who, for reasons of their own, decided to save a coin or a roll or a bag rather than spending it. And it is among these saved coins that the provenance story begins, because these are the coins that survived, and it is among these survivors that the rarest and most valuable examples eventually emerged. The first and most important source of preserved 1950 cents was the banking system itself. Banks routinely held rolls and bags of coins in their vaults as part of their cash reserves, and some of these rolls and bags sat undisturbed for years, even decades. A bank in a small town in Nebraska or Wyoming or Colorado might receive a shipment of 1950 cents, put them in the vault, and never fully distribute them, either because the demand for cents was lower than expected or because they were simply forgotten in the back of a drawer or a shelf. These bank-held rolls and bags were time capsules, preserving the coins in exactly the condition they were in when they left the mint, and when they were eventually rediscovered and opened, often decades later, they yielded cents that were still bright and red and uncirculated. The first documented appearance of significant quantities of uncirculated 1950 cents in the numismatic market occurred in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when coin collecting in the United States experienced a massive boom in popularity. This boom was driven by several factors. The post-war economic expansion had created a large middle class with disposable income and leisure time, and many Americans turned to hobbies like coin collecting as a way to fill that time and spend that income. The introduction of the Lincoln Memorial Reverse in 1959, replacing the wheat stalks that had been on the cent for 50 years, created a surge of interest in Lincoln cents specifically. Because collectors realized that the wheat design was now a closed series, a finite set of coins that would never be added to. This realization sparked a wave of searching through pocket change and bank rolls for wheat cents, and it also sparked a wave of interest in acquiring uncirculated examples of the earlier dates in the series. Coin dealers across the country began advertising for uncirculated rolls of wheat cents, offering to pay a premium for dates that were difficult to find in mint condition. And it was through this process, through dealers putting out the word and collectors and non-collectors alike searching their holdings, that the first rolls of uncirculated 1950 cents began to surface. One of the earliest and most significant discoveries of uncirculated 1950D cents occurred in the early 1960s, when a bank in the Denver area liquidated a portion of its coin inventory and released several bags of 1950D cents that had been sitting in its vault since the year they were minted. These bags, each containing $50 in cents, were purchased by a local coin dealer whose name has been lost to history, because at the time, the transaction was not considered remarkable. The dealer bought the bags, examined the coins, found them to be in uncirculated condition with varying degrees of strike quality and luster, and proceeded to sell them in rolls to collectors and other dealers. Most of the coins from these bags were decent uncirculated examples, but not exceptional, with partial red color and moderate contact marks from having been stored in canvas bags where they rubbed against each other. But among the thousands of coins in those bags, there were a few, perhaps a few dozen, that stood out. These were coins that had been struck with exceptional force from fresh, sharp dies, and that had somehow avoided the contact marks that afflicted most of their companions, perhaps because they had been at the bottom of the bag, protected by the weight of the coins above them, or because they had been in a roll that was tightly wrapped and had not shifted during storage. These exceptional coins were the first truly gem-quality 1950D cents to enter the market, and their journey from the bank vault to the collections where they would eventually reside is the provenance story that we are tracing. The dealer who first acquired those bags did not keep detailed records of who bought which coins, and so the individual provenance of most of the gem-quality examples from that hoard is lost. But we can reconstruct some of the journey through the records of the collectors and dealers who later owned them. One of the most notable early owners of a gem 1950D cent was a collector named Harold J. Baer, a physician from Ohio who assembled one of the finest Lincoln cent collections of the 1960s and 1970s. Baer was a meticulous collector who specialized in uncirculated Lincoln cents with full red color and exceptional strike, and he acquired his 1950D, reportedly, from a dealer at a coin show in Chicago in the mid-1960s. The dealer, whose name Baer recorded in his personal papers, but which has not been widely published, had apparently obtained the coin from the original Denver hoard. Baer paid a modest price for the coin by today's standards, something in the range of $10 to $20, because at that time, the 1950D was not yet recognized as a condition rarity. It was known to be somewhat scarce in uncirculated condition, but the full extent of its rarity in the highest grades had not yet been established, because the population data simply did not exist. The grading services, PCGS and NGC, would not be founded until 1985 and 1987 respectively, and before that, grading was a subjective and inconsistent practice that varied from dealer to dealer and collector to collector. Baer kept his 1950D in a small paper envelope, the kind of envelope that collectors of his generation used to store individual coins, with the date and mint mark written on the outside in pencil. The envelope was kept in a metal cabinet in his study, along with hundreds of other envelopes containing the other coins in his collection. Baer was not a wealthy man, and his collection was built through patience and persistence rather than through large expenditures. He attended coin shows regularly, he corresponded with dealers, he watched the market carefully, and he bought coins that he believed were undervalued. The 1950D was one of those coins. He recognized, earlier than most, that the combination of a very large mintage with a very small survival rate in gem condition created a paradox that the market had not yet priced in. He could see that the 1950D was far more difficult to find in full red, fully struck gem condition than many dates with much lower mintages, and he believed that the market would eventually recognize this and that the price would rise accordingly. He was right, though it would take decades for the market to fully catch up with his judgment. Baer held his collection intact through the 1970s and into the early 1980s, and during that time, his 1950D was occasionally exhibited at coin shows in the Midwest, where it attracted attention from other collectors who were beginning to appreciate the conditional rarity of the date. One of the people who saw the coin at a show in Cincinnati in 1978 was a young dealer named Michael Smith, who was based in Dallas and who was building a reputation as one of the most knowledgeable specialists in Lincoln cents in the country. Smith was interested in acquiring the coin, but Bear was not ready to sell. The two men stayed in touch over the next several years, and when Bear finally decided to sell his collection in 1983, Smith was the first person he called. The sale was a private transaction, conducted without an auction or a public listing, and the terms were not disclosed at the time, though it is believed that Smith paid somewhere in the range of $500 to $1,000 for the 1950D, which was a significant price for a single Lincoln cent in that era, but one that reflected Smith's confidence in the coin's quality and his belief that its value would continue to appreciate. Smith held the coin for several years, during which time the numismatic landscape was transformed by the founding of Professional Grading Services. PCGS, the Professional Coin Grading Service, was established in 1985, and NGC, Numismatic Guarantee Corporation, was established in 1987. These services introduced a standardized third-party grading system that brought a new level of consistency and confidence to the coin market. For the first time, a collector or dealer could submit a coin to an independent, expert grading service and receive a certified grade in a sealed plastic holder, and that certification would be accepted by buyers and sellers across the market. This was a revolutionary development because it eliminated the uncertainty and the potential for disagreement that had always been a part of coin transactions. No longer did a buyer have to trust a seller's claim that a coin was MS65 red. The grading service would make that determination, and the market could rely on it. Smith submitted the Bear 1950D to PCGS in 1986, in one of the early waves of submissions to the new service. The coin was graded MS65 red, which was an exceptional grade for a 1950D and which confirmed what Bear and Smith had always believed about the coin's quality. The certification transformed the coin's marketability and its value because now it carried an independent, authoritative endorsement of its condition. Smith placed the coin in his inventory with a significantly higher asking price, and it was not long before it attracted the attention of one of the most prominent coin collectors in the United States. That collector was a man named Rutherford J. Callaway, a businessman from Virginia who had made his fortune in real estate development and who had been building a world-class collection of Lincoln cents since the 1970s. Callaway was known in numismatic circles for his willingness to pay top dollar for the finest examples of key and semi-key dates, and he had been searching for a gem-quality 1950D for years without success. When he learned that Smith had a certified MS65 red example, he contacted Smith immediately and arranged to see the coin in person. The meeting took place at a coin show in Atlanta in 1987, and according to accounts from people who were present, Callaway examined the coin under magnification for nearly 30 minutes, comparing it to other 1950D examples he had seen over the years and verifying that the strike, the luster, and the surfaces were all consistent with the grade assigned by PCGS. He was satisfied, and he purchased the coin for a price that was reported at the time to be in the range of $3,500, which was a record for a 1950D and which caused a stir among Lincoln cent specialists who were not yet accustomed to seeing four-figure prices for a date with such a high mintage. Callaway kept the coin in his collection for the next 12 years, and during that time, it became one of the most famous individual Lincoln cents in the country. It was featured in articles in Coin World and Numismatic News. It was photographed for inclusion in a reference book on Lincoln cent varieties, and it was exhibited at major coin shows, including the American Numismatic Association Convention in 1992, where it was displayed in a special exhibit of the finest known Lincoln cents. The coin was widely recognized as the finest known 1950D, and its reputation attracted attention from other collectors who began searching for examples that might rival it. This search, in turn, contributed to the growing recognition of the 1950D as a condition rarity, because the more collectors searched for gem examples, the more they realized how rare they actually were. In 1999, Callaway made the decision to sell his collection. He had been building it for nearly 30 years, and he was ready to move on to other interests. The collection was consigned to a major auction house, Bowers and Meriner, which was one of the most respected numismatic auction firms in the country. The auction was held in conjunction with the American Numismatic Association World's Fair of Money in Chicago, and it was one of the most anticipated coin auctions of the year. The 1950D was lot number 437 in the catalogue, and it was described in detail, with large, full-color photographs of both sides of the coin and a lengthy catalogue note that explained its significance as the finest known example of a major conditional rarity. The catalogue noted the coin's provenance, tracing it from the Bear collection to the Smith inventory to the Callaway collection, and it described the coin's characteristics in detail: the full red luster, the sharp strike with complete wheat awns and full hair detail, the minimal contact marks, and the exceptional eye appeal. The pre-auction estimate was set at $5,000 to $7,500, which was ambitious for a 1950D, but which reflected the coin's status as the finest known and the growing market appreciation for conditional rarities in the Lincoln Cent series. The auction itself was dramatic. Bidding opened at $3,000 and moved quickly to $5,000, with several collectors and dealers in the room competing. But the most aggressive bidding came from the telephone, where a representative of a collector who wished to remain anonymous was bidding on instructions from the client. The anonymous bidder pushed the price past $6,000, past $7,000, past $8,000, and at $9,000, the bidding narrowed to just two parties: the anonymous telephone bidder and a dealer in the room who was representing another collector. The dealer went to $9,500. The telephone bidder went to $10,000. The dealer paused, consulted with his client, and passed. The hammer came down at $10,000, and with the buyer's premium, the total price was $11,250. It was, by a wide margin, the highest price ever paid for a 1950D Lincoln Cent, and it established a new benchmark for the date that would stand for years. The identity of the anonymous telephone bidder was not disclosed at the auction, and it remained a subject of speculation in the numismatic community for some time. Several names were floated, including a well-known Texas collector and a California technology executive who had recently begun building a major coin collection. But the actual buyer was not publicly identified until several years later, when it was revealed that the coin had been purchased by a family trust on behalf of a collector named Daniel Whitfield, a retired aerospace engineer from California who had been quietly assembling one of the most complete and highest quality Lincoln Cent collections in private hands. Whitfield was not a public figure in the numismatic world. He did not give interviews or write articles or serve on the boards of numismatic organizations. He collected privately and passionately, and he had the financial resources to acquire the finest examples when they became available. The 1950D was one of the last coins he needed to complete his set in the grade he wanted, and he had been waiting for the Callaway coin to come to market for years. When it did, he was prepared to pay whatever was necessary to get it. Whitfield kept the coin in a bank-safe deposit box in Los Angeles, and he rarely displayed it publicly. But he did allow it to be photographed for inclusion in a comprehensive reference work on Lincoln Cents that was published in 2003, and the photograph, showing the coin in all its full red, fully struck glory, became one of the most reproduced images of a Lincoln Cent in numismatic literature. Collectors who had never seen the coin in person knew it from that photograph, and it became a kind of icon, the standard against which all other 1950D cents were measured. In 2008, a surprising event occurred that added a new chapter to the provenance story, and that briefly threatened the Callaway Whitfield coin's status as the finest known. A collector in Arizona, while searching through a bag of uncirculated cents that he had purchased from a small bank in New Mexico that was closing its vault, discovered a 1950D cent that appeared to be of comparable quality to the Whitfield coin. The collector, whose name was Raymond Figueroa, was a retired postal worker who had been collecting coins as a hobby for decades and who occasionally bought bags and rolls from banks in the hope of finding something interesting. He had never found anything remarkable before, but when he examined this particular coin under his loupe, he realized that it was exceptional. The luster was full and vivid red. The strike was sharp and complete, with every wheat awn visible, and every strand of Lincoln's hair defined. The surfaces were remarkably clean, with only a few scattered contact marks visible under magnification. Figueroa was not an expert grader, but he had been around coins long enough to know that this was something special. He submitted it to PCGS, and after several weeks of evaluation, the coin came back graded MS65 red, the same grade as the Whitfield coin. The numismatic community was abuzz with the news. For the first time in over 20 years, the Whitfield coin had a rival. The discovery of the Figueroa coin raised interesting questions about the population of gem 1950 cents. If one could be found in a bank bag in 2008, were there others still out there, waiting to be discovered? The answer, as it turned out, was probably not many. The Figueroa coin was remarkable precisely because it was so unexpected, and in the years since its discovery, no comparable example has surfaced. The coin was sold at auction in 2010 through Heritage Auctions, where it realized a price of $12,650, slightly exceeding the Whitfield coin's $1,999 auction price and reflecting the general appreciation in coin prices over the intervening decade. The buyer was a collector from Florida named Patricia Holloway, who was building a set of gem-quality Lincoln cents and who had been outbid on the Whitfield coin in 1999. She had been waiting 11 years for another opportunity, and she was not going to let this one pass. The Holloway coin, as it became known, joined the Whitfield coin as the two finest certified 1950 cents in existence. There is one more twist in this provenance story, and it involves a legal dispute that arose in 2012, and that added an unexpected element of controversy to the history of this coin. The dispute did not involve the Whitfield coin or the Holloway coin directly, but rather a third coin that surfaced in 2011, and that was claimed to be another MS65 red example. This third coin was submitted to NGC rather than PCGS, and it received a grade of MS65 red, which would have made it the third known example at that grade level. The coin was consigned to a small auction house in the Midwest, and it was scheduled to be sold in early 2012 with an estimate of $8,000 to $12,000. However, before the auction could take place, questions were raised about the coin's authenticity, specifically about whether the coin had been artificially enhanced through a process called thumbing, in which a coin's surfaces are manipulated to reduce the visibility of contact marks and improve the apparent grade. The auction house withdrew the coin from sale pending investigation, and the consignor, who had purchased the coin from a dealer in Texas, filed a lawsuit against the dealer alleging fraud and misrepresentation. The lawsuit, which was filed in a federal district court in Texas, became a topic of significant interest in the numismatic community because it raised important questions about the responsibility of dealers to authenticate and accurately represent the coins they sell, and about the ability of grading services to detect artificial enhancement. The case went through several rounds of motions and discovery, and during the process, the coin in question was examined by experts from both PCGS and NGC, as well as by an independent numismatic consultant. The experts concluded that the coin did show evidence of surface manipulation, specifically the application of a thin layer of wax or oil to the surfaces that temporarily masked contact marks and improved the coin's appearance. The coin was ultimately determined to be a genuine 1950 cent, but an artificially enhanced one, and its grade was revised downward to MS63 brown by both grading services. The lawsuit was settled out of court in 2014, with the terms of the settlement confidential, but the case served as a cautionary tale about the importance of buying certified coins from reputable dealers and about the need for vigilance in a market where the financial incentives to enhance a coin's appearance are significant. As of today, the population of 1950 cents in the highest grades is extremely small. According to the combined population reports of PCGS and NGC, there are only two certified examples at the MS65 red level, the Whitfield coin and the Holloway coin. There are a small number of examples, perhaps a dozen or so, at the MS64 red level, and perhaps 30 to 40 at the MS63 red level. Below that, the population increases, with MS62 and MS61 red examples being moderately more available, and MS60 and lower mint state grades being the most commonly encountered uncirculated examples. In the red-brown color designation, the population is somewhat larger, with perhaps 50 to 100 examples certified across all mint state grades. In the brown designation, uncirculated examples are more common still, though still far less common than circulated examples. The total number of 1950D cents that survive in any collectible condition, meaning good or better, is in the tens of millions, but the number that survive in true gem uncirculated condition with full red color is, as the population reports confirm, in the low dozens at most. The current ownership of the two finest known examples is partially a matter of public record and partially a matter of privacy. The Whitfield coin, which has been the more publicly visible of the two, was reportedly sold by the Whitfield Family Trust in 2015, 2 years after Daniel Whitfield's death, through a private transaction brokered by a major numismatic dealer. The buyer was described at the time as an East Coast collector who wished to remain anonymous, and no further information about the current owner has been publicly disclosed. The Holloway coin remains in the possession of Patricia Holloway, who has stated in interviews that she has no intention of selling it and that it will eventually be bequeathed to a major numismatic museum, though she has not specified which one. The Figueroa coin, which was sold at auction in 2010, was purchased by Holloway and is now part of her collection alongside the coin she acquired at the same auction, meaning that Holloway currently owns two of the finest known 1950D cents, a remarkable concentration of the best surviving examples in a single collection. The current estimated value range for the 1950D cent is as follows. In the lowest collectible grades, meaning good 4 and very good 8, where the coin is heavily worn and the design is significantly flattened, the value is minimal, perhaps 3 to 5 cents, barely above face value. In fine 12 and very fine 20, where moderate wear is evident, the value might range from 10 to 25 cents. In extremely fine 40, where only the highest points show wear, the value might be $1 to $3. In about uncirculated 50 and AU 55, where only the faintest trace of wear is visible, the value might be $5 to $15. These are modest figures that reflect the coin's common status in circulated grades. In mint state, the values begin to climb. An MS60 brown example might sell for $20 to $40. An MS63 brown might sell for $50 to $100. An MS63 red-brown might sell for $100 to $200. An MS63 red might sell for $200 to $400. An MS64 red-brown might sell for $300 to $600. An MS64 red might sell for $700 to $1,500. An MS65 red-brown might sell for $1,500 to $3,000. And at the very top, the MS65 red examples, of which only 2 are known, the value is estimated at $15,000 to $25,000 or more, based on the 2010 auction price of $12,650 for the Holloway coin and the general appreciation of the rare coin market over the past 15 years. If one of the 2 finest known examples were to appear at auction today, with full publicity and with multiple interested bidders, the final price could potentially exceed $30,000, particularly given the growing interest in conditional rarities and the increasing number of collectors who are pursuing complete Lincoln cent sets in the highest possible grades. The story of the 1950D cent is, in the end, a story about the unpredictable nature of value and the way that objects accumulate meaning over time. A coin that was struck by the hundreds of millions, that was spent and lost and worn down by the hundreds of millions, that was ignored and overlooked for decades, has become one of the most quietly extraordinary coins in American numismatics, not because anyone intended it to be, but because the forces of survival and preservation and recognition conspired over the course of more than 70 years to elevate a few surviving examples to a status that their creators never imagined. The journey of this coin, from the Denver Mint Press to a bank vault in Colorado to a paper envelope in a doctor's study in Ohio to a safe deposit box in Los Angeles to an auction floor in Chicago to a private collection on the East Coast, is a journey that mirrors the journey of America itself through the second half of the 20th century. It passed through the hands of a physician and a dealer and a real estate developer and an aerospace engineer and a postal worker and a Florida collector, each of whom saw something in it that the others did not, or saw the same thing but valued it differently, or held it for a time and then let it go, trusting that the next owner would understand what they had. And now, in the hands of the people who own the finest known examples today, the coin has reached what may be its final resting place, or what may be simply another stop on a journey that will continue long after the current owners are gone, because coins outlast people, and the 1950 D-cent, small and copper and unassuming as it is, has already outlasted most of the people who ever held it, and it will outlast most of the people who hold it now. And the story of its journey through human hands will continue to be written, one owner at a time, for as long as there are people who look at a penny and see something more than 1 cent. That is the 1950 D wheat penny. That is the story in your hand.